Today, I'll be taking a look at what may be the most recently published book I've done for this series. Patron Samuel Jones has requested a novel titled The Fifth Season, and it was published in 2015 by author N.K. Jemisin. About the author. Nora K. Jemisin was born in Iowa City, Iowa, but she spent most of her young life in Mobile, Alabama, with summers spent in New York City. She went to New Orleans to get a bachelor's degree in psychology, and she got her master's degree in education from the University of Maryland. After that, she spent 10 years as a teacher in Massachusetts, and these days she's a career counselor in New York City. Jemisin's writing career began around the year 2000, back when she was in grad school. She knew she wanted to write speculative fiction, but she didn't have any connections, so her first real writing experience was to send a novel to a publisher, have it sit in the slush pile for a few years, and then have it rejected and sent back. Publishers get so many book submissions each year that this is basically what happens to everyone regardless of quality, unless you have a literary agent. But for Jemisin, it was a disheartening experience. Still, it didn't discourage her completely. Instead, she went to Viable Paradise, a workshop that explains the business and publishing side of writing, and after that she began to see success from writing short stories and further novels. Jemisin's official novel debut is called The 100,000 Kingdoms, and it came out in 2010. It's about a world in which the gods are real, and humanity has managed to enslave some of them. Jemisin has said in an interview that the original version was a fairly traditional epic fantasy tale that followed several characters, visited a few different countries, and centered around getting the MacGuffin to the place of power, but then she completely rewrote it with a stream of consciousness style that was very much not your standard epic fantasy. Jemisin worried it would be unpublishable, but publishers broke down the door to get her book, and it would go on to win a Locus Award for Best First Novel. The Fifth Season is the first book of her second series, the Broken Earth trilogy. It earned a Hugo Award for Best Novel the next year, which happens to mark the first time any African-American author has won that particular award. And then she got the hat trick by getting Hugo Awards for the two sequel books, The Obelisk Gate and The Stone Sky, and that marks the first time anyone has ever won 3 Hugo Awards for Best Novel in 3 consecutive years. As such, the question now isn't, is it any good, but rather, how good is it? Let's find out by taking a look at the story. The fifth season takes place on a world with a single continent, a Pangea. The people who live on it call it the Stillness, but only as a joke. The planet suffers from constant seismic activity, and global catastrophes are a regular occurrence. When it happens, it's called a fifth season after an old phrase. Spring, summer, fall, winter, and death is the fifth season. In this world, most people can sense earthquakes coming, but a few people have the power to stop, control, and start earthquakes. With enough practice, they can control just about any kind of vibration. These people are called Origines, if you're feeling polite, and Ragas, if you'd rather be rude. The book starts with a male Origine and a creature made of living rock that's shaped like a person, and they're both overlooking the city of Eumenes. Eumenes is the capital of Sansa, an empire in decline, but despite that decline, it's still the most powerful city in the world. It sits on the most stable part of the continent, and thanks to that, it survived 4 fifth seasons. But now it's rubble, because the man reaches down to an old fault line and tears the whole continent in half, right along the equator, and right through the city. The planet will now suffer a season of darkness that will last thousands of years. The story then moves on to the protagonist of the story, and it constantly flips between 3 stories told during 3 different times in her life. For simplicity's sake, I'll summarize the stories chronologically. The protagonist's first name is Damaya. She was born in the Midlats, the Middle Latitudes, and like most Origines, she discovered her power accidentally during a moment of anger. So her parents lock her in the barn and call the authorities, which is better than what could have happened, because she could have been lynched, even though she's only like 5 or 6 years old. The authorities turn out to be a guardian named Shafa, who touches the back of her skull before taking her to Eumenes. Along the way, he breaks her hand to see whether she can control her power during a moment of pain, and to reinforce their new rules, and he tells her the story of the first guardian. An Origin named Missalem was destroying town after town of the Sansa Empire, and then he went after the Emperor directly. The Emperor emptied out the city since Origins need to drain motion and heat to use their powers, but he kept his bodyguard with him. The bodyguard, Shemshena, threw a knife that broke Missalem's torus of power, and then killed him. She became the first Guardian, and later the Empire would found the Fulcrum, a place that trains, guards, and imprisons the Origins of the Empire. Demaya spends her time at the Fulcrum learning how to control her abilities, rather than socializing with the other Grits, the other Origins her own age. So it's a surprise to her when a popular boy comes to talk to her. But it's not a surprise when the other girls start pranking her as revenge for speaking to him. Except one prank gets her drunk, and there is zero tolerance for that among Origins of any age. She could have been disappeared for that if the wrong person caught her. So she conspires with another outcast, but the outcast turns out to have been responsible for everything, and so she gets disappeared for smuggling in the alcohol. Time passes, and Demaya spends most of her free time exploring the Fulcrum facility, which is much bigger than it needs to be. One day, she spots a strange girl sneaking into the ranks of the Grits, a girl who identifies herself as Binoff of the leadership caste. She found out there's a big empty space at the center of the Fulcrum and she wants to see it, and she talks Demaya into helping her since she also noticed the empty space. Demaya uses her growing abilities to discover a secret door in the Guardian wing of the building, and once they sneak through, the two find a giant hexagonal opening in the ground, with a bunch of tiny needles sticking out of the open space. A Guardian grabs them and starts lecturing them, but then she starts speaking in a strange voice that talks about some kind of ancient conflict. Before she can harm the kids, Shafa comes in and kills her. He explains that the Guardians implant those needles from the opening into their heads to give them anti-Origin abilities, but they need to make connections with Origins to stay sane. The Guardian woman let her connections lapse, so she got possessed. Shafa then tells Demaya that she has to take her first ring test, first or 10, or else she'll be killed for being a disobedient Grit. Years pass, and Demaya is up to her 4th ring, and she has an Origin name, Cyanite. Cyanite gets a new assignment she already hates, because it's to travel with a 10-ring man and have sex with him until she conceives a child. This is standard practice at the Fulcrum, and really in the Sansa Empire in general, since Breeder is one of the common use castes. The man she's supposed to have sex with is named Alabaster, and he was apparently named ironically because his skin is black as coal. Alabaster turns out to be as unhappy with Cyanite's assignment as she is, but he's used to it since he's a powerful Origin who was born and raised in the Fulcrum, and he's had over a dozen children in this way. The two head to the east coast of the continent to clear some coral out of a bay, and along the way, Cyanite notices Alabaster quieting even the smallest microtremors as they travel. He tells her he does this to give the node maintainers a break, but she doesn't see it as a favor since they're probably bored with their dull assignment. But then, a sudden, unexpected earthquake appears, and it threatens to erupt a hotspot supervolcano nearby. Alabaster ends the threat, but he does so by drawing on Cyanite's power and some additional power he gets from nearby, neither of which he's supposed to be able to do. After the threat passes, they head straight to the nearest node since the maintainer there is most likely responsible for the quake, but when they get there, they find everybody dead since the Origin sucked up all of their energy to make the quake. The maintainer is also dead, and Cyanite discovers that he is a lobotomized child. Most likely one of Alabaster's kids, too. The Fulcrum does this to kids who have a lot of power but can't master control, since even when they're lobotomized, their brains can still calm earthquakes in the area. Alabaster gets downright murderous when he sees all of this, but with only Cyanite around, all he can really do is rage to himself. The two reach the coastal city of Alia after that, and after Alabaster refuses to take any shit from the city's bureaucrats, someone poisons his food. So Alabaster reaches out for extra power again, and this time Cyanite realizes that he's drawing power from a floating obelisk. The obelisks have been around this whole time, floating through the sky, seemingly at random, but doing nothing. It's also worth noting that an obelisk created the large hole at the center of the Fulcrum. Using the obelisk's power, Alabaster fine-tunes his control to vibrate the poison up his throat and out his body, but the effort leaves him exhausted. Thus, it's up to Cyanite to clear the harbor, although that's easy enough for a four-ringer to accomplish. However, it turns out the coral is growing on a substrata that's slowly rising through the harbor and could block the bay entrance itself given time. So she breaks it free from its surroundings, and the blockage turns out to be a half-broken obelisk with a stone eater, one of those living rock people from earlier, stuck in the middle. And once it's free, it floats up into the sky and starts hovering above the harbor. Cyanite and Alabaster are ordered to stay put for the time being, which Alabaster finds suspicious because the Fulcrum should want them to get away from the obelisk, so that their higher-ups can study it in secret. Then they find out why when a Guardian shows up to kill them both. The Guardian uses his anti-origin abilities and a special dagger to stop both of them from using their powers. But before he can kill them, Cyanite reaches out to the broken obelisk for help. She discovers that the Stone Eater at its center is alive and well, and then the world explodes around her. Cyanite wakes up on an island far off the coast of the continent, which is normally a terrible place to be thanks to the constant threat of hotspot volcanoes and tsunamis. She and Alabaster were brought to the island straight through the rock below the ocean, thanks to a Stone Eater who presents as a woman, seems to know Alabaster from long before, and responds to the name Antimony. Antimony soon leaves, but not before showing Cyanite that her reckless use of power has turned Alia into a smoldering volcano. Cyanite and Alabaster discover that the island is inhabited by a pirate community that predates the Sansa Empire. The reason they've survived for so long is because they make Origins their leaders, rather than their slaves, and the Origins keep earthquakes and tsunamis from wiping them out. Both of them end up starting a three-way relationship together with one of the Origins in charge, Enon, but it's only sort of polyamorous because they both still dislike each other. Yet despite that, their efforts on the road bore fruit, and Cyanite has a child that they name Corundum. Cyanite and Alabaster live in peace on the island for several years, but one day Cyanite decides that she wants to go on the raiding ship since she's bored of staying on the island. She feels guilty about Alia, so while they're out, she goes to the flaming crater where it used to be and closes the new hotspot. However, it turns out this was a fulcrum trap, since the only reason they hadn't fixed it already was to use it as bait for Cyanite or Alabaster. They track her ship back to the island and send several ships out to attack it, and while the islanders put up a good fight, Alabaster gets dragged away by the Stone Eater, and both Cyanite and Corundum get captured by the fulcrum forces. Cyanite would rather see her son die than be enslaved by the fulcrum, so she reaches out to a nearby obelisk, deliberately this time, and shatters everything around her. Somehow she survives, although her child doesn't. She invents a new name to become anonymous, Essen, and she wanders out into the mid-latitudes to lose herself. Essen settles in a small town named Tiramo, marries a man named Jija, and has 2 children, both Origins. 10 years pass, and then the man and the Stone Eater, by this point it should be clear that the man is Alabaster, break the continent in half. But that's almost an afterthought to Essen, because a couple days before that happens, she discovers her younger child dead in their house. He was beaten to death, apparently by her husband, Jija, and both he and Essen's daughter Nassun are missing. Because of this, Essen has a hard time dealing with reality and other people, especially since she was already kind of mourning her first child. Eventually, Essen recovers enough to set herself a goal, which is to track down Jija, kill him for what he did, and hopefully find her daughter alive. She convinces the village head to let her go in peace, since by now people have started to figure out that she's an Origin, but one of the gate guards tries to kill her as she leaves. So she shatters the crossbow bolt that was shot at her, drains the life out of several people standing next to her, and cracks the village's aquifer, dooming it to a slow death now that the 5th season to end all seasons has descended. Essen meets several travelers while she's on the road, and one of them is a strange boy caked in mud and who has strangely white skin, hair, and eyes. She probably would have figured out that it's a Stone Eater right away if she were in a healthy state of mind, but as it is, she doesn't realize the truth until he turns a dangerous predator to stone with his touch. For some reason, the Stone Eater named Hoa is oddly attracted to Essen, much like how Antimony watches over Alabaster. However, he doesn't want to explain why, since he thinks Essen won't like him afterwards. The two pick up a third traveler on the road, a woman who looks like she was homeless even before the season started, but who gives away that she's a trained geologist from the comments she makes. She calls herself Tonki, and Essen notices that she's a trans woman when she runs out of hormone potions. Hoa can sense Essen's daughter, as he can sense all Origines, and the three follow his lead to a strange, apparently abandoned town where all the buildings have different designs. Hoa senses a lot of Origines present there, and because of that he can't tell if Nassun and Jija are still there. They get accosted by an Origine named Yika, and it turns out that Origines and Stone Eaters are both collecting there and taking shelter in a massive underground geo that some ancient civilization hollowed out and lived in for a time. Not only that, but it turns out they kept air circulating by using Origine power. Yika and the other Origines are trying something new, living openly and as equals to normal people, instead of living in fear or as slaves. During their stay in the geode community, Essen discovers that her husband and daughter aren't present, and she discovers that Tonki is actually that leader caste girl she met back in the Fulcrum. She's not leadership caste anymore because she wouldn't stop asking questions, plus, being a trans woman just isn't done in a society obsessed with eugenics and caste systems. So her parents changed her name and caste and shipped her off to a university where she spent her life studying the obelisks. She also used her resources to keep track of Essen, even after she apparently died twice, and so neither Tonki nor Hoa met Essen by happenstance. After she learns all of this, Essen gets one more surprise visit from an old friend, Alabaster, who is slowly turning to stone and being eaten by antimony, thanks to the effort it took to break the continent in half. He tells Essen that he wants to make things even worse, and he mentions that the planet had a moon. But that is where the book ends. The analysis. This book has a lot going on in terms of themes, so I don't have the time to get into all of them. Still, I can at least discuss the most obvious ones. I have heard Nora Jemisin described as a post-colonial author, and that certainly seems accurate. A post-colonialism, as a fiction genre, is hard to define precisely, but in broad terms, it's any look at the world from the perspective of the currently or recently oppressed. It's history written by the losers, by the populations that suffered so that others could get rich, or who had to hide who they really were, or risk being ostracized, imprisoned, or worse. And it is absolutely true that the fantasy genre is in desperate need of post-colonial perspectives. After all, the foundation of the genre is that it's a retelling of all the myths and legends that have filtered down through European civilizations. Epic fantasy is a black and white conflict between noble heroes with handsome features battling against hordes of deformed, ugly monsters and the wicked tyrants who lead them. Evil villains are clearly evil, the good guys are clearly good, and the fate of the world depends on a few powerful heroes who can stop the hordes of darkness from destroying the light of civilization. Now, I will say that right from the beginning, there were fantasy authors who didn't write stories that fit this mold, but the cliché exists because a whole lot of authors followed the conventions. It's easy to see how these clichés are based on colonial perspectives. The evil hordes are swarthy or dark-skinned. The so-called civilization is often expanding, pushing out tribes of obviously evil goblins and orcs so that human farmers can settle the land and put it to good use, unlike those stupid and violent nomads. Maybe there's an evil empire out there that a plucky band of rebels needs to defeat, but by and large, the rebels fight the empire to put a rightful king in place, not to encourage self-rule or democratization. But then you've got the 5th season, in which the protagonist is simultaneously an incredibly powerful wizard and a harshly abused and effectively enslaved minority. Essen, in every period, has to cope with living in a society that thinks she's worthless, less than human. And since she's grown up in that society, she's internalized this belief and has to fight against her own thoughts at times. Then there's the fact that this fear of Origines is justified. Unlike someone from a different culture or a different race, origins can show up in any family, at any time. And unlike gender and sexual minorities, origins can kill people and destroy entire towns with a thought. If a 5-year-old origin throws a temper tantrum and can't control their power, houses will collapse, and people will die. As such, origins don't map perfectly to any real-life minority, but the fact that they don't have to is an advantage of the speculative fiction genre. Anyway, the book makes a point of showing that origins don't have to be despised and collared and controlled. Groups like the Pirates give origins leadership positions, and extinct societies have apparently harnessed origin power in ways that go way beyond moving rocks and stilling earthquakes. It's only the Sansa Empire that really persecuted their origins, and while the laws of their society are literally carved in stone, there are other laws on equally old stones that contradict them. But because they persecuted origins, Sansa was able to exploit them and use that exploitation to keep the heart of the Empire stable in more ways than one. And that, in Alabaster's opinion, is why Sansa and the city of Eumenes had to die. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a giant robot anime with a really big twist.